They cornered her in the hospital corridor, demanding to know who gave her permission to enter the trauma bay. But when she rolled up her sleeves to show them her credentials, what they saw weren't certification cards or medical licenses. They were scars. Precise, surgical marks that told a story of advanced combat medicine performed under enemy fire. The kind of scars that only came from saving lives when death was winning and time had run out. The resident who'd been shouting about protocol violations suddenly went quiet, because the rumors about the quiet medical equipment sales rep, who sometimes lingered too long in their emergency department, weren't just hospital gossip. They were fragments of a truth so classified that even her own medical expertise had to remain hidden. The woman they thought was just another vendor trying to make quota had actually broken every record that mattered, and broken hearts along the way, including her own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency department at Riverside General Hospital hummed with the controlled chaos that marked the beginning of another Portland winter evening. Outside, freezing rain tapped against windows like impatient fingers, creating a crystalline coating on everything it touched. The smell inside was purely medical, antiseptic overlaying the metallic tang of blood, the sharp bite of cleaning solutions, and that indefinable scent of human stress that clung to hospital corridors like invisible fog. Monitors beeped in steady rhythms, interrupted occasionally by the sharp electronic alarm that meant someone's situation had just gotten more complicated. Gurneys rolled across polished linoleum floors, their wheels creating a percussion section for the symphony of urgent voices and medical equipment that never quite fell silent. Sarah Mitchell moved through this environment like she belonged there, though her visitor's badge and the small medical equipment sample case clearly marked her as an outsider. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that people often mistook for shyness. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the kind of unremarkable business casual clothing that made her nearly invisible in most settings. A navy blue blazer over a white blouse, dark slacks, and comfortable walking shoes that suggested she spent a lot of time on her feet visiting clients. Everything about her appearance suggested exactly what her identification cards claimed: a medical equipment sales representative making her routine rounds to maintain relationships with hospital staff and demonstrate new products. She paused near the central nursing station, checking her phone with the practiced gesture of someone whose day was scheduled in 15-minute increments. The sample case at her side contained exactly what anyone would expect to find: brochures for the latest patient monitoring systems, tablet computers loaded with product specifications, and demonstration units for medical devices that promised to make healthcare more efficient and effective. Nothing unusual, nothing that would draw unwanted attention. Just another sales professional doing another job in another hospital, trying to make quota while providing genuinely useful services to overworked medical staff. But Sarah's eyes moved through the emergency department with a different kind of attention than most visitors paid to their surroundings. She noted the locations of crash carts and defibrillators, counted the number of available trauma bays, observed the flow patterns of medical personnel during shift changes. Her gaze lingered on the central supply areas and emergency equipment storage, cataloging resources with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on knowing where to find critical supplies under extreme pressure. When she watched the medical staff work, her focus was less on sales opportunities and more on operational efficiency, team coordination, and the subtle signs of stress that indicated a department stretched beyond its normal capacity. The weather outside had been deteriorating throughout the afternoon, and the emergency department showed the effects of increased patient volume that always accompanied hazardous driving conditions. Additional staff had been called in to handle the expected surge of motor vehicle accidents, slip and fall injuries, and weather-related medical emergencies. The veteran nurses moved with the heightened awareness that came from years of experience, reading environmental signs and preparing for the worst. Newer staff members carried themselves with the slightly elevated tension of people who understood that busy nights in emergency medicine often became very difficult nights without much warning. Dr. Michael Harrison stood near the main desk, reviewing patient charts on a tablet while simultaneously monitoring radio traffic from emergency medical services. As Chief of Staff at Riverside General, he carried the responsibility for overall hospital operations during crisis situations, and the weather forecast suggested this might become one of those nights when administrative decisions could directly impact patient outcomes. At 54, Harrison had developed the ability to project calm authority even when circumstances were spiraling toward chaos. His presence in the emergency department, rather than his administrative office, sent a clear message to staff that senior leadership was prepared to provide direct support if the situation warranted it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harrison noticed Sarah near the nursing station and nodded politely. They'd met several times during her previous visits to demonstrate new monitoring equipment, and he remembered her as knowledgeable about her products and respectful of hospital procedures. Unlike many sales representatives who seem to view medical facilities as opportunities to practice high-pressure sales techniques, Sarah understood that healthcare environments required different protocols. She asked intelligent questions about clinical applications, listened carefully to feedback from nursing staff, and never pushed for decisions during times when medical personnel were obviously focused on patient care priorities. Director Rebecca Torres emerged from Trauma Bay 3, pulling off latex gloves with the sharp snap that punctuated the end of another successful stabilization procedure. As Emergency Department Director, Torres had spent the last 15 years building Riverside General's trauma program into one of the most respected on the West Coast. She possessed the rare combination of clinical expertise and administrative skill that allowed her to manage both patient care and departmental operations with equal competence. Her staff trusted her clinical judgment absolutely, and hospital administration respected her ability to deliver results under pressure while maintaining the highest standards of patient safety. Torres spotted Harrison near the central desk and moved in his direction, her expression carrying the focused intensity that indicated important information needed to be shared. She'd been monitoring emergency medical services radio traffic throughout her shift, and the reports were painting a picture of increasingly dangerous road conditions throughout the Portland metropolitan area. State police had issued travel advisories for most major highways, and emergency responders were reporting significantly longer response times due to weather-related driving hazards. The conversation between Harrison and Torres was conducted in the low tones medical professionals used when discussing potentially serious situations within earshot of patients and families. Sarah, standing close enough to overhear fragments of their discussion, caught references to accident scenes, ambulance delays, and resource allocation decisions that suggested the evening was likely to become more challenging than originally anticipated. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but something in her posture shifted slightly, a subtle change in stance that indicated heightened awareness of developing circumstances. Dr. Ryan Brooks arrived for his evening shift 15 minutes late, his hair still damp from a hasty shower, and his attitude suggesting that punctuality was less important than making sure everyone noticed when he finally appeared. At 29, Brooks had completed his residency in emergency medicine 6 months earlier and carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed that medical school performance and residency evaluations were reliable predictors of real-world clinical success. His colleagues found him technically competent, but exhausting to work with, the kind of physician who treated every patient interaction as an opportunity to demonstrate his superior knowledge, and every staff meeting as a chance to explain why current protocols could be improved if people would simply listen to his suggestions. Brooks immediately began reviewing the patient board with the critical eye of someone looking for problems to solve and opportunities to showcase his expertise. He questioned nursing assignments, suggested modifications to treatment protocols, and offered unsolicited advice about case management decisions that had been made before his arrival. His behavior created the kind of low-level tension that experienced emergency department staff had learned to manage. Through a combination of professional patience and selective hearing, but newer employees found his presence genuinely disruptive to team dynamics. Nurse Jessica Chen had been working the emergency department for 3 years, long enough to develop strong clinical skills, but not quite long enough to develop the emotional resilience that marked truly veteran emergency nurses. At 26, she remained genuinely invested in patient outcomes, but had also begun to adopt some of the protective cynicism that helped healthcare workers maintain their sanity in environments where human tragedy was a daily occurrence. Chen possessed a sharp wit and an unfortunate tendency to process workplace stress through gossip and commentary about hospital politics, patient behavior, and the personal lives of her colleagues. Chen noticed Sarah near the nursing station and immediately began speculating about her presence with the kind of casual malice that passed for entertainment during slow periods. She'd observed Sarah's previous visits and developed theories about her background, her relationships with hospital staff, and her reasons for spending more time in the emergency department than seemed necessary for routine sales calls. These theories ranged from the plausible to the wildly imaginative, but Chen shared them all with equal enthusiasm whenever she found receptive audiences among her coworkers. Emt Marcus Rivera had been responding to emergency calls for 8 years, long enough to develop genuine expertise in pre-hospital care, but not quite long enough to outgrow the competitive edge that marked many emergency responders who took pride in their ability to function effectively under extreme pressure. At 31, Rivera possessed excellent technical skills and genuine dedication to patient care, but he also carried himself with the attitude of someone who believed that emergency medical services represented the most important component of the healthcare system and that hospital-based medical personnel often failed to appreciate the complexity and difficulty of pre-hospital emergency medicine. Rivera's ambulance had been dispatched to multiple weather-related accidents throughout the afternoon, and he'd returned to Riverside General with patients whose injuries reflected the hazardous driving conditions that were developing throughout the region. His radio reports had been professional and thorough, but his interactions with hospital staff carried an undercurrent of frustration about resource allocation, response times, and administrative decisions that he believed were negatively impacting patient care quality and emergency responder safety. The veteran members of the emergency department staff moved through their routines with the practiced efficiency that came from years of experience managing unpredictable workloads under constantly changing circumstances. Dr. Patricia Williams, who had been practicing emergency medicine for 25 years, positioned herself near the trauma bays where her expertise would be most valuable if serious cases began arriving. Her presence provided reassurance to younger staff members who understood that Williams had managed every type of medical emergency multiple times and could provide guidance when situations exceeded their experience levels. Paramedic Tom Anderson checked and rechecked his equipment with the methodical attention to detail that marked emergency responders who understood that equipment failures during critical moments could have catastrophic consequences. At 42, Anderson had responded to thousands of emergency calls and developed an intuitive sense for reading environmental conditions and predicting when routine situations might suddenly become dangerous. His radio remained tuned to emergency services frequencies, monitoring traffic that would provide early warning if the weather situation was deteriorating faster than official forecasts predicted. Nurse Katie Johnson, despite being only 24 and relatively new to emergency medicine, had already demonstrated the kind of observational skills and clinical intuition that marked potentially excellent emergency nurses. She watched the more experienced staff members for cues about how to prepare for changing circumstances, and she'd noticed that several veterans were quietly making preparations that suggested they expected the evening to become more challenging than current patient volume indicated. The emergency department's central monitoring system displayed vital signs from all occupied patient beds, creating a visual representation of the human drama playing out in each treatment area. Heart rates, blood pressures, oxygen saturation levels, and respiratory patterns told stories of pain, fear, recovery, and hope through the precise language of medical data. The rhythm of normal hospital operations continued, but underneath the surface routine, experienced staff members were making the subtle adjustments in preparation and positioning that indicated professional awareness that circumstances might change rapidly. Sarah continued her apparent sales rounds, moving through the department with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose schedule allowed for flexibility in timing and duration of client visits. She stopped to speak briefly with nursing staff about equipment performance issues, listened to feedback about user interface improvements for monitoring systems, and demonstrated features of new products that might enhance patient care capabilities. Her interactions were professional, knowledgeable, and genuinely helpful, the kind of vendor relationships that busy medical staff actually appreciated rather than merely tolerated. But observers with sufficient experience in reading human behavior might have noticed that Sarah's attention to her immediate surroundings exceeded what most sales professionals typically displayed during routine client visits. Her awareness of emergency equipment locations, her unconscious monitoring of radio traffic, and her subtle positioning near critical supply areas suggested familiarity with emergency medical environments that went beyond casual professional exposure. She moved through the emergency department not like someone visiting an unfamiliar workplace, but like someone who understood how such environments functioned during crisis situations and instinctively prepared herself to respond effectively if circumstances required immediate action. The first major accident report crackled over the emergency services radio at exactly 6:47 p.m., interrupting the controlled routine of evening shift operations with the kind of announcement that transformed busy emergency departments into scenes of coordinated urgency. Multiple vehicle collision on Interstate 84 eastbound, approximately 8 miles from the hospital. Initial reports suggested at least 4 vehicles involved, with unknown numbers of casualties and injuries, ranging from minor to potentially life-threatening. Weather conditions at the accident scene were deteriorating rapidly, complicating both rescue operations and emergency medical response. Harrison and Torres exchanged the kind of meaningful look that passed between experienced medical administrators when routine evenings suddenly became potential disasters. The resources currently available in the emergency department were adequate for normal patient volumes, but major multi-vehicle accidents often produced casualty numbers and injury severities that could overwhelm even well-staffed emergency facilities. Additional personnel would need to be called in, trauma bay preparations would need to be expedited, and surgical teams would need to be placed on standby alert pending initial assessment of incoming patients. The transformation of the emergency department from routine operations to crisis response mode began immediately, with staff members moving through practiced protocols that had been drilled repeatedly but were now being implemented under actual emergency conditions. Sarah watched this transformation with the focused attention of someone who understood both the complexity of the coordination required and the critical importance of every decision being made. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but something in her posture suggested that she was following the preparations with more than casual interest. The radio traffic from the accident scene painted an increasingly serious picture as Emergency responders arrived and began initial assessment of casualties and scene conditions. The collision had occurred during a brief but intense ice storm that had transformed a normally safe stretch of interstate highway into a hazardous obstacle course of vehicles sliding beyond driver control. Emergency medical services were reporting multiple patients with injuries requiring immediate transport to trauma-capable facilities, and the weather conditions were significantly complicating both patient extraction and ambulance transport operations. Brooks responded to the emergency activation with the elevated energy of someone who viewed crisis situations as opportunities to demonstrate superior clinical capabilities under pressure. He began questioning protocol decisions, suggesting alternative approaches to patient triage, and offering commentary about resource allocation strategies that he believed would improve overall emergency response effectiveness. His behavior created exactly the kind of distraction that experienced emergency department staff least needed during actual crisis management. But his recently completed residency training gave him sufficient clinical authority that his suggestions couldn't be completely ignored. Sean immediately began speculating about the potential drama and excitement that major trauma cases would bring to what had been shaping up as a relatively routine evening shift. Her enthusiasm for the anticipated chaos reflected the attitude of someone who hadn't yet developed the emotional maturity to understand that emergency medicine's most exciting moments were often simultaneously its most tragic. She began preparing gossip about how different staff members were likely to perform under pressure, creating entertainment value from circumstances that would probably involve genuine human suffering. Rivera received dispatch orders to return immediately to the accident scene for patient transport operations, despite having just completed a previous run that had already extended his shift beyond normal duration. The deteriorating weather conditions were stretching emergency medical services beyond their normal capacity, requiring all available ambulances to maintain continuous operation until the immediate crisis was resolved. His frustration about working conditions and resource limitations was evident, but his commitment to professional responsibility overcame personal complaints about overtime requirements and hazardous driving conditions. As the emergency department staff implemented their crisis response protocols, Sarah quietly repositioned herself in an area where she could observe operations without interfering with medical personnel movement patterns. Her behavior appeared entirely appropriate for a vendor who understood that sales activities needed to be suspended during emergency situations, but her positioning and attention suggested knowledge of emergency department operations that exceeded typical civilian familiarity with medical crisis management procedures. The first ambulance arrived 18 minutes after the initial radio report, bringing casualties whose injuries would test every aspect of Riverside General's emergency medicine capabilities and reveal exactly who among the assembled staff possessed the experience, judgment, and skill necessary to save lives when every decision mattered and there was no time for second chances. The sirens wailed through the Portland night as 3 ambulances converged on Riverside General's emergency bay, their red and blue lights painting the rain-slicked pavement in urgent colors. Sarah watched from the main corridor as trauma teams assembled with the swift precision of a military operation, each member moving to predetermined positions that had been practiced countless times but never felt routine when lives hung in the balance. The controlled chaos of major trauma response was beginning, and everyone in the emergency department understood that the next few hours would test every aspect of their training, experience, and professional judgment. Dr. Patricia Williams took charge of the first trauma bay, her silver hair pulled back severely and her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. At 55, Williams had seen enough emergency situations to recognize immediately when circumstances were evolving beyond standard protocols. The radio reports from the ambulances painted a picture of injuries that would require not just competent medical care, but exceptional surgical skill and innovative thinking. She called for additional blood products from the hospital's blood bank, requested that surgical teams be placed on immediate standby, and began reviewing the inventory of specialized medical equipment that might be needed for complex trauma. Repairs. The automatic doors of the emergency bay slid open with mechanical precision as the first ambulance backed into position. T. Marcus Rivera jumped from the driver's seat, his uniform soaked with freezing rain and his expression grim, with the weight of what he'd witnessed at the accident scene. The patient he was transporting had been trapped in a vehicle for over an hour while rescue teams worked to extract him safely, and the delay had complicated what were already serious internal injuries. Rivera began shouting medical information to the trauma team before the ambulance doors were fully open, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that every second of delay increased the probability of losing a patient who might still be saved with immediate intervention. 23-year-old construction worker Jake Morrison had been driving home from his job site when the ice storm struck with sudden ferocity, transforming familiar roads into treacherous surfaces where even experienced drivers lost control. Without warning, his pickup truck had slid sideways into the path of an oncoming semi-trailer, resulting in a collision that crushed the driver's side of his vehicle and trapped him beneath twisted metal while emergency responders worked frantically to reach him. The extraction had been complicated by unstable vehicle positioning and the need to prevent further injury during the rescue process. But Morrison had remained conscious throughout the ordeal, talking to rescue workers and providing information about his condition that helped guide their efforts. Dr. Williams took one look at Morrison's vital signs and immediately recognized that his injuries exceeded the normal capabilities of most emergency physicians. His blood pressure was dropping steadily despite aggressive fluid resuscitation. His abdominal distension suggested significant internal bleeding, and his pain responses indicated possible spinal involvement that could complicate any surgical intervention. The trauma required immediate surgical exploration, but the complexity of his injuries meant that even experienced surgeons would face difficult decisions about treatment priorities and operative approaches. Williams began calling for consultations from surgical specialists while simultaneously implementing emergency stabilization procedures that might buy enough time for definitive treatment. The second ambulance arrived carrying Maria Santos, a 41-year-old nurse driving home from her shift at a different hospital when the storm conditions caused her vehicle to slide off the highway embankment. The irony of a healthcare worker becoming a trauma patient was not lost on the emergency department staff, who understood that professional medical knowledge often made patient experiences more frightening rather than less because healthcare workers understood exactly what their symptoms indicated about the seriousness of their conditions. Santos had suffered multiple rib fractures, a punctured lung, and facial injuries from airbag deployment, but she remained alert and was providing detailed information about her symptoms and medical history that was proving invaluable for treatment planning. Nurse Jessica Chun took charge of Santos's care with the particular intensity that healthcare workers displayed when treating colleagues who understood the medical implications of every procedure being performed. Chun's usual gossip and commentary disappeared completely as she focused on providing the kind of compassionate, competent care that she hoped she would receive if their positions were reversed. The professional solidarity that existed among healthcare workers transcended departmental boundaries and personal differences when one of their own required emergency treatment, and Chun was determined to demonstrate the highest standards of nursing care under pressure. The third ambulance brought the most challenging case of all. 16-year-old Emma Chun had been a passenger in a vehicle driven by her 17-year-old boyfriend when weather conditions caused him to lose control during what should have been a routine drive to a movie theater. The accident had resulted in severe trauma to her chest and abdomen, with internal injuries that were causing rapid blood loss and respiratory complications that required immediate mechanical ventilation. Her youth and previously excellent health meant that her body was fighting to survive with remarkable resilience. But the extent of her injuries would require surgical expertise that pushed the boundaries of what even experienced trauma surgeons could accomplish under emergency conditions. Dr. Ryan Brooks immediately positioned himself as the primary physician for Emma's case, viewing her complex injuries as an opportunity to demonstrate the advanced techniques he had learned during his residency training. His confidence in his abilities was evident as he began issuing orders to nursing staff and calling for surgical consultations. But experienced members of the trauma team exchanged worried glances because they recognized that Brooks's enthusiasm was not matched by the kind of seasoned judgment that life-threatening cases demanded. The gap between textbook knowledge and real-world clinical experience was most apparent during exactly these kinds of situations, where theoretical understanding needed to be combined with intuitive decision-making and the emotional resilience to function effectively when patients' lives depended on split-second choices. Sarah remained positioned near the central nursing station, ostensibly reviewing product specifications on her tablet, but actually monitoring the developing medical crisis with the focused attention of someone whose own experience had taught her to recognize when emergency situations were exceeding available resources. Her positioning allowed her to observe all 3 trauma bays simultaneously, while remaining out of the way of medical personnel who were moving between patients and coordinating care decisions. To casual observers, she appeared to be simply a sales representative who understood that business activities needed to be suspended during medical emergencies. But her level of attention to clinical details suggested knowledge of trauma medicine that went far beyond typical civilian familiarity with healthcare operations. The emergency department's communication systems were handling an increasing volume of radio traffic as additional emergency medical services units responded to secondary accidents caused by the same weather conditions that had created the initial multi-vehicle collision. State police were reporting that Interstate 84 remained hazardous despite sand and salt applications, and emergency responders were predicting that additional casualties would continue arriving throughout the evening as drivers encountered road conditions that exceeded their vehicle's capabilities and their own driving experience. Hospital administrators were beginning to consider whether additional resources needed to be activated, including calling in off-duty staff and implementing disaster response protocols that would transform routine operations into crisis management mode. Director Rebecca Torres moved between trauma bays with the systematic efficiency of someone who had managed countless emergency situations and understood that effective leadership during medical crises required constant assessment of resource allocation, personnel capabilities, and patient care priorities. Her experience had taught her to recognize early warning signs that indicated when situations might overwhelm available resources, and the current combination of patient complexity and weather-related complications was creating exactly the kind of perfect storm that could transform a busy evening into a genuine disaster, if not managed with exceptional skill and foresight. Torres paused at Emma's trauma bay, where Dr. Brooks was explaining to the nursing staff why standard protocols needed to be modified to accommodate the advanced techniques he intended to implement. His commentary included detailed descriptions of surgical procedures he had observed during his residency and theoretical approaches he believed would be superior to conventional treatment methods. The nursing staff listened politely while simultaneously implementing the stabilization procedures that their experience told them were immediately necessary, creating a disconnect between Brooks's academic explanations and the practical medical care that was actually being provided to maintain the patient's vital functions. Sarah noticed the tension developing around Emma's case and found herself moving slightly closer to the trauma bay, her attention drawn by the subtle signs of dysfunction. That experienced emergency personnel learned to recognize when team coordination was breaking down under pressure. Brooks's confidence was admirable, But his tendency to prioritize explanation over action was creating delays in treatment implementation that could prove dangerous for a patient whose condition was deteriorating rapidly. The gap between his theoretical knowledge and practical experience was becoming apparent to everyone except Brooks himself, who remained convinced that his superior understanding of current medical techniques would produce better outcomes than conventional approaches. The complexity of Morrison's injuries was becoming more apparent as Dr. Williams completed her initial assessment and began planning surgical intervention. His internal bleeding was more severe than initially suspected, and the imaging studies revealed damage to multiple organ systems that would require coordinated repair efforts involving several surgical specialties. The challenge was complicated by his deteriorating vital signs, which indicated that time was running out for successful intervention. Williams had managed similar cases during her career, but never under circumstances where multiple critical patients were simultaneously competing for the same limited resources and personnel. Williams called for immediate surgical consultation, but the hospital's trauma surgeons were already stretched thin by other emergency cases that had arrived earlier in the evening. The combination of weather-related accidents and normal emergency department volume was creating exactly the kind of resource shortage that emergency medicine administrators planned for but hoped never to experience. Additional surgical teams could be called in from home, but the time required for off-duty personnel to reach the hospital during hazardous weather conditions meant that immediate decisions needed to be made with currently available staff. Maria Santos was responding well to treatment for her chest injuries, and her medical knowledge was proving valuable in helping the emergency staff understand her symptoms and treatment responses. Her experience as a healthcare worker allowed her to provide detailed information about her condition while maintaining the emotional control necessary to assist with her own care. Shun appreciated having a patient who understood medical terminology and could participate actively in treatment decisions. But Santos's professional knowledge also meant that she was fully aware of the seriousness of her colleagues' conditions and the resource limitations that were affecting treatment options for all the trauma patients. The emergency department's blood bank was beginning to show the strain of multiple trauma patients requiring blood products simultaneously. Hospital policy required maintaining adequate reserves for potential additional casualties, but the current patient load was consuming blood products at a rate that would soon require activation of emergency protocols for obtaining additional supplies. Torres was monitoring blood bank inventory while simultaneously coordinating with surgical services and considering whether regional disaster response protocols needed to be implemented to ensure adequate resources for all patients requiring treatment. M. Rivera completed his patient transfer responsibilities and began preparing his ambulance for additional emergency runs. But the weather conditions were making transport operations increasingly dangerous for emergency responders. Radio traffic indicated that several ambulances had experienced accidents or mechanical problems related to road conditions, reducing the number of emergency medical services units available for patient transport. The cascade effect of weather-related complications was creating exactly the kind of systemic strain that emergency response planners worked to prevent but occasionally could not avoid when multiple factors combined to exceed normal operational capabilities. Sarah observed the developing crisis with the calm attention of someone who had witnessed similar situations under different circumstances. Her positioning near the central nursing station allowed her to monitor radio communications, observe patient care activities, and assess resource utilization patterns without interfering with medical operations. Her apparent focus on her tablet and product materials masked a level of situational awareness that would have been remarkable for most civilians, but seemed natural for someone whose background had included training in crisis assessment and resource management under extreme pressure. The automatic doors of the emergency bay opened again as another ambulance arrived, bringing casualties from a secondary accident. that had occurred when emergency responders were working at the original collision scene. The additional patients would strain the emergency department's resources even further, requiring Torres to make difficult decisions about patient care priorities and resource allocation. The evening that had begun as routine emergency department operations was rapidly evolving into exactly the kind of mass casualty situation that tested every aspect of hospital emergency preparedness and personnel capabilities. Dr. Brooks was becoming increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as resistance to his treatment recommendations for Emma's case. His suggestions for advanced interventions were being questioned by nursing staff who had more experience with trauma cases but less formal education in current medical techniques. The conflict between theoretical knowledge and practical experience was creating tension that interfered with team coordination at exactly the moment when seamless collaboration was most critical for patient survival. Brooks's confidence in his abilities remained unshaken, but his inability to recognize the value of experience-based clinical judgment was becoming a liability for effective patient care. Williams completed her assessment of Morrison's condition and made the difficult decision that his injuries required immediate surgical intervention, despite the risks involved in operating on a patient whose vital signs continued to deteriorate. The alternative to immediate surgery was certain death, but the complexity of his injuries meant that even successful surgical repair might not prevent complications that could prove fatal. Her decision reflected the kind of clinical judgment that could only be developed through years of experience making life and death choices under pressure, where perfect solutions rarely existed and optimal outcomes required accepting calculated risks. The emergency department was reaching the point where normal operations would need to be suspended in favor of crisis management protocols that prioritized immediate, life-saving interventions over routine procedures and administrative requirements. Torres was preparing to implement disaster response measures that would transform the hospital's operational structure and call in additional personnel from throughout the medical center. The evening that had started with weather advisories and increased patient volume was becoming a genuine test of emergency preparedness and institutional capabilities. Sarah continued her quiet observation of the developing crisis, her attention focused on details that most civilians would not have noticed or understood. The coordination patterns among medical personnel, the resource allocation decisions being made by administrative staff, the communication protocols being used to manage multiple simultaneous emergencies, all indicated levels of systemic stress that required exceptional leadership and professional competence to manage successfully. Her understanding of these dynamics suggested familiarity with crisis situations that extended far beyond casual exposure to healthcare environments. The radio crackled with reports of additional accidents throughout the Portland metropolitan area as weather conditions continued to deteriorate. Emergency responders were requesting assistance from neighboring jurisdictions, and hospital administrators throughout the region were coordinating to ensure that casualties could be distributed among facilities with available resources. The local emergency that had begun at Riverside General was becoming part of a wider regional crisis that would test the resilience of the entire emergency response system. Brooks made a treatment decision for Emma that directly contradicted the recommendations of the nursing staff who had been monitoring her condition. His choice reflected confidence in advanced techniques he had studied but never implemented under actual emergency conditions, and his dismissal of alternative approaches suggested that he viewed the current situation primarily as an opportunity to demonstrate his superior medical knowledge rather than as a life-threatening emergency requiring collaborative decision-making and experienced clinical judgment. The consequences of that decision would become apparent within minutes, transforming what had been a manageable medical emergency into a crisis that would reveal exactly who among the assembled medical personnel possessed the experience, skill, and courage necessary to save lives when conventional approaches failed and innovative Solutions were the only hope for patient survival. Torres received notification that the hospital's trauma surgeons were all committed to current cases and that additional surgical resources would not be available for at least 90 minutes due to weather-related transportation delays. The timing meant that critical treatment decisions would need to be made with currently available personnel, regardless of their experience levels or comfort with complex trauma cases. The institutional support systems that normally provided backup for challenging medical situations were unavailable exactly when they were most needed. Williams began Morrison's emergency surgery with the assistance of a surgical resident whose experience with trauma cases was limited, but whose willingness to follow directions precisely made him valuable during operations where every decision carried life-threatening consequences. The surgical team worked with the focused intensity of professionals who understood that their patient's survival depended on technical precision and clinical judgment that allowed no margin for error. Their concentration was absolute, but everyone in the operating room understood that they were attempting repairs that pushed the boundaries of what could be accomplished under emergency conditions. Sarah's attention was drawn to Emma's trauma bay, where the nursing staff was implementing emergency interventions to address complications that had developed following Brooks's treatment decisions. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and the apparent conflict between Brooks's theoretical approach and the practical experience of the nursing staff was creating exactly the kind of team dysfunction that could prove fatal during medical emergencies. Her observation of the developing crisis was characterized by the calm assessment of someone who had witnessed similar situations and understood both the medical implications and the human dynamics that determined outcomes during life-threatening emergencies. The emergency department's communication systems were handling constant radio traffic as emergency responders throughout the region coordinated their responses to weather-related casualties and transportation challenges. The volume of information being processed was testing the capabilities of hospital personnel who were simultaneously managing multiple critical patients and preparing for additional casualties, whose arrival times and injury severities remained unknown. The complexity of coordination required exceeded normal operational procedures and demanded innovative approaches to resource management and patient care prioritization. The automatic doors opened again as another ambulance arrived, bringing casualties whose injuries would add to the already overwhelming patient load and force additional difficult decisions about treatment priorities and resource allocation. The evening that had begun with routine emergency department operations was becoming a genuine test of institutional capabilities and individual professional competence under circumstances that exceeded normal training and preparation. The arrival of each additional patient increased the pressure on systems and personnel that were already stretched beyond normal capacity. Dr. Brooks was discovering that complex trauma cases required clinical judgment that could not be learned from textbooks or developed through theoretical study alone. The gap between his confidence and his actual experience was becoming apparent as Emma's condition continued to deteriorate despite his interventions. The nursing staff was implementing alternative approaches based on their practical experience, but the conflict between different treatment philosophies was creating delays and confusion that could prove dangerous for a patient whose survival depended on immediate, coordinated medical care. Torres made the decision to implement formal disaster response protocols that would transform hospital operations and mobilize additional resources from throughout the medical center. The activation of these procedures represented acknowledgement that the current emergency exceeded normal operational capabilities and required institutional responses that prioritized immediate, life-saving interventions over routine procedures and administrative requirements. The decision would have far-reaching implications for hospital operations and would test emergency preparedness systems that had been planned extensively but never implemented under actual crisis conditions. The transformation of Riverside General Hospital from routine operations to crisis response mode was beginning, with personnel throughout the facility being called to emergency assignments and normal procedures being suspended in favor of protocols designed for mass casualty situations. The evening that had started with weather advisories was becoming exactly the kind of institutional test that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of emergency preparedness planning and implementation. Sarah remained positioned where she could observe the developing crisis while staying out of the way of medical personnel who were implementing emergency procedures under extreme pressure. Her apparent role as a sales representative provided perfect camouflage for observation activities that would have drawn unwanted attention under normal circumstances. But her level of understanding of emergency operations suggested background knowledge that extended far beyond typical civilian familiarity with healthcare environments. The crisis was about to reveal capabilities and knowledge that she had worked carefully to keep hidden, but circumstances were developing that would make continued concealment impossible. The moment arrived with the sharp electronic alarm that every healthcare worker dreaded hearing during critical situations. Emma's cardiac monitor erupted into the piercing rhythm that announced ventricular fibrillation, the chaotic heart rhythm that killed patients within minutes if not corrected immediately. Dr. Brooks froze for a crucial second, his theoretical knowledge suddenly inadequate when confronted with the reality of a 16-year-old girl whose heart had stopped beating effectively. The confidence that had carried him through medical school and residency training evaporated as he stared at the monitor display, knowing that every second of hesitation decreased the probability of successful resuscitation. Nurse Katie Johnson reacted with the instinctive speed that marked truly gifted emergency nurses, immediately beginning chest compressions while calling for the crash cart and defibrillator. Her movements were fluid and precise, each compression delivered with exactly the force and frequency required to maintain blood circulation to vital organs, while the medical team prepared for electrical cardioversion. Johnson's relative inexperience in emergency medicine was irrelevant during cardiac arrest situations, where basic life support skills and the ability to function under extreme pressure mattered more than years of accumulated knowledge. The crash cart arrived within 30 seconds, wheeled into position by EMT Tom Anderson, who had been restocking supplies when the alarm sounded. Anderson's 42 years and extensive experience with emergency medical situations made him invaluable during resuscitation efforts, where familiarity with equipment and medications could mean the difference between successful intervention and tragic loss. He began preparing the defibrillator while Johnson continued chest compressions, their coordination reflecting the kind of seamless teamwork that developed among emergency responders who had worked together during countless life-threatening situations. Dr. Brooks stood paralyzed by the gap between his theoretical understanding of cardiac arrest management and the reality of implementing life-saving interventions under pressure. His residency training had included numerous simulated resuscitation scenarios, but the artificial environment of medical education could not replicate the emotional intensity and time pressure of actual patient care when death was winning and immediate action was required. The textbook protocols that had seemed straightforward during training became overwhelmingly complex when applied to a real patient whose survival depended on his clinical judgment and technical skill. Sarah Mitchell watched the developing crisis from her position near the central nursing station, her apparent focus on medical equipment brochures masking a level of attention to clinical details that would have seemed remarkable for a sales representative, but was natural for someone whose background included advanced training in emergency medicine under combat conditions. Her observation of the resuscitation efforts was characterized by the calm assessment of someone who had witnessed similar situations and understood both the medical procedures being implemented and the human dynamics that determined outcomes during life-threatening emergencies. the defibrillator charged with a distinctive whining sound that announced preparation for electrical cardioversion, the procedure that could restore normal heart rhythm if delivered properly and promptly. Anderson confirmed that the paddles were positioned correctly and that all personnel were clear of the patient before delivering the electrical shock that would either restart Emma's heart or indicate the need for additional interventions. The moment of electrical discharge was always dramatic, causing the patient's body to jerk involuntarily, while everyone watched the cardiac monitor for signs of restored normal rhythm. The first defibrillation attempt was unsuccessful, with Emma's heart monitor continuing to display the chaotic rhythm that indicated continued cardiac arrest. Johnson immediately resumed chest compressions while Anderson prepared for a second electrical shock, their movements coordinated by the shared understanding that brain damage from oxygen deprivation became increasingly likely with each minute of unsuccessful resuscitation. The time pressure was immense, but both emergency responders had learned to function effectively despite the emotional weight of knowing that their actions directly determined whether a young patient would survive or die. Dr. Brooks finally began participating in the resuscitation effort, but his interventions were hesitant and poorly coordinated with the actions of the nursing staff, who had been managing the emergency while he struggled to overcome his paralysis. His attempt to take charge of the situation was undermined by his obvious uncertainty about specific procedures and medications, creating exactly the kind of leadership vacuum that could prove fatal during medical emergencies when decisive action was required and any delay increased the probability of patient death. Director Rebecca Torres arrived at Emma's trauma bay as the second defibrillation attempt was being prepared, her assessment of the situation immediate and comprehensive. Torres had managed hundreds of cardiac arrest cases during her 15 years as emergency department director, and her experience allowed her to recognize instantly when resuscitation efforts were being compromised by team dysfunction or inadequate leadership. Her presence brought the kind of calm authority that emergency situations required, but she also understood that successful intervention would depend on technical competence and clinical judgment that could not be improvised during actual emergencies. The second electrical shock restored a weak but detectable heart rhythm, though Emma's blood pressure remained dangerously low and her respiratory status continued to deteriorate. The successful defibrillation was encouraging, but everyone involved in her care understood that preventing another cardiac arrest would require addressing the underlying injuries that had caused her heart to stop beating effectively. The trauma that had brought her to the emergency department was still killing her, and temporary restoration of heart rhythm would prove meaningless unless the bleeding and organ damage could be controlled surgically. Johnson continued manual ventilation while monitoring Emma's vital signs for any indication of improvement or further deterioration. Her nursing training had prepared her for the technical aspects of post-resuscitation care, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional impact of performing life-saving interventions on a patient who was barely older than her own younger sister. The professional composure that emergency healthcare workers were expected to maintain became increasingly difficult when patients were young, and their injuries were the result of random accidents rather than voluntary risk-taking behaviors. Brooks attempted to reassert his authority over Emma's case by ordering medications and procedures that reflected his understanding of current resuscitation protocols, but his lack of confidence was apparent to everyone involved in her care. The gap between theoretical knowledge and practical experience was most evident during exactly these kinds of situations, where successful outcomes required not just familiarity with medical procedures, but also the clinical judgment and emotional resilience necessary to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure. His hesitation during the initial cardiac arrest had undermined his credibility with the nursing staff who would be implementing his treatment orders. Torres recognized that Emma's condition required immediate surgical intervention to address the internal bleeding that was causing her cardiovascular instability, But the hospital's surgical resources were already committed to other trauma cases, and additional personnel remained unavailable due to weather-related transportation delays. The institutional support systems that normally provided backup during complex medical emergencies were unavailable exactly when they were most needed, forcing emergency department staff to consider alternative approaches that might not be optimal, but represented the only available options for saving the patient's life. Anderson completed his assessment of Emma's respiratory status and determined that her lung function was deteriorating despite mechanical ventilation, indicating possible complications from her chest injuries that would require immediate intervention. His experience with pre-hospital emergency medicine had taught him to recognize signs of tension, pneumothorax, and other life-threatening conditions that could develop rapidly in trauma patients. The additional complications were making her case increasingly complex and would require treatment decisions that exceeded the normal scope of emergency department capabilities. Sarah continued her observation of the resuscitation efforts, her attention focused on details that most civilians would not have noticed or understood. The coordination patterns among medical personnel, the equipment being used for life support interventions, the medication choices being made to support cardiovascular function all indicated levels of medical complexity that required exceptional training and experience to manage successfully. Her understanding of these clinical details suggested familiarity with advanced trauma care that extended far beyond typical civilian exposure to healthcare environments. The emergency department's communication systems were handling increasing volumes of radio traffic as additional casualties from weather-related accidents continued to arrive throughout the Portland metropolitan area. Hospital administrators were coordinating with emergency medical services to ensure that patients could be distributed among facilities with available resources, but the widespread nature of the weather emergency was creating systemic strain that affected every aspect of regional healthcare delivery. The local crisis at Riverside General was becoming part of a broader emergency that would test the resilience of the entire healthcare system. Johnson noticed changes in Emma's neurological responses that suggested possible brain injury from the period of cardiac arrest, when oxygen delivery to her brain had been compromised. The signs were subtle but significant, indicating that even successful resuscitation might not prevent long-term complications that could affect her cognitive function and quality of life. The realization that their life-saving efforts might result in survival with permanent disability added emotional complexity to medical decisions that were already difficult due to resource limitations and time pressure. Brooks was struggling with treatment decisions that required clinical experience he did not possess, but his reluctance to acknowledge his limitations was preventing him from seeking assistance from more experienced colleagues who could provide guidance during the complex case management. His confidence in his medical training was undermining his ability to recognize when situations exceeded his capabilities and required collaborative approaches that prioritize patient outcomes over professional pride. The disconnect between his theoretical knowledge and practical experience was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone involved in Emma's care. Torres made the difficult decision to attempt emergency surgical intervention in the trauma bay rather than waiting for operating room availability, recognizing that Emma's condition was deteriorating too rapidly to allow for standard protocols and procedures. The decision to perform surgery outside the controlled environment of an operating room carried significant risks, but the alternative was almost certain death from continued bleeding and organ failure. Her choice reflected the kind of clinical judgment that could only be developed through years of experience, managing life and death situations where perfect solutions rarely existed. The trauma bay was rapidly transformed into an improvised surgical suite, with nursing staff preparing instruments and equipment under conditions that were far from ideal, but represented the only available option for providing immediate life-saving intervention. The procedures required for emergency surgery in a trauma bay demanded exceptional skill and adaptability from medical personnel, who were already stretched beyond normal capacity by the multiple casualties and resource limitations. Everyone involved understood that they were attempting something that pushed the boundaries of standard medical practice. Anderson assisted with the surgical preparation while simultaneously monitoring Emma's vital signs for any indication that her condition was continuing to deteriorate despite the aggressive interventions being implemented. His dual responsibilities required the kind of multitasking ability that marked experienced emergency responders who had learned to manage multiple critical tasks simultaneously under extreme pressure. The complexity of providing both life support and surgical assistance exceeded normal training protocols and demanded innovative approaches to patient care coordination. Sarah moved slightly closer to the trauma bay where the emergency surgery was being prepared, her apparent interest in observing medical procedures seeming appropriate for a sales representative whose products were used in similar situations. Her positioning allowed her to monitor the surgical preparations while remaining outside the sterile field that was being established around Emma's treatment area. To casual observers, her attention appeared professionally motivated, but her level of understanding of surgical procedures and equipment requirements suggested knowledge that went beyond typical vendor familiarity with medical applications. Dr. Williams emerged from Morrison's surgery with the exhausted expression that marked surgeons who had successfully completed operations that pushed their technical skills to the limit. Her patient was stable but critical, requiring intensive monitoring and additional interventions that would test the hospital's resources for days or weeks. The successful surgical repair had prevented immediate death, but had not eliminated the possibility of complications that could still prove fatal. Her emergence from surgery meant that experienced surgical expertise was now available for other patients, but Williams was physically and emotionally drained from the complex operation she had just completed. Torres briefed Williams on Emma's condition and the decision to attempt emergency surgery in the trauma bay, seeking guidance from someone whose surgical experience exceeded that of anyone else currently available in the emergency department. Williams assessed the situation immediately, recognizing both the necessity of immediate intervention and the significant risks involved in performing surgery under suboptimal conditions. Her evaluation would determine whether the proposed surgery could proceed or whether alternative approaches needed to be considered, despite the likelihood that delay would prove fatal. The consultation between Torres and Williams was conducted in the low tones that medical professionals used when discussing life and death decisions within earshot of patients and families. Their conversation addressed technical aspects of the proposed surgery, resource requirements, personnel capabilities, and the probability of successful outcomes under current conditions. Both physicians understood that they were making decisions that would determine whether a 16-year-old girl would survive her injuries or become another casualty of circumstances beyond anyone's control. Johnson continued providing life support for Emma while the surgical consultation was taking place. Her attention divided between monitoring vital signs and preparing equipment for the emergency operation that was being planned. Her relative inexperience with trauma surgery was balanced by her exceptional competence in emergency nursing and her ability to anticipate the needs of surgical teams working under pressure. The coordination required between nursing and surgical personnel would be critical for successful outcomes during the improvised operation. Brooks remained involved in Emma's care, but had been effectively marginalized by the arrival of more experienced physicians who possessed the clinical judgment necessary for complex surgical decision-making. His theoretical knowledge remained valuable for understanding medical procedures and monitoring patient responses, but his lack of practical experience with trauma surgery meant that his role would be limited to assistance and observation rather than primary decision-making. The humbling experience of recognizing his limitations was emotionally difficult, but professionally necessary. Williams made the decision to proceed with emergency surgery despite the suboptimal conditions, recognizing that Emma's injuries would prove fatal without immediate intervention, regardless of the risks involved in operating outside standard protocols. Her choice reflected years of experience making difficult decisions under pressure, where perfect solutions rarely existed and optimal outcomes required accepting calculated risks. The decision to operate represented both the best hope for saving Emma's life and a significant gamble with potentially tragic consequences if complications developed. The trauma bay surgery began with Williams performing procedures that normally required the controlled environment and specialized equipment available only in dedicated operating rooms. Her surgical skill was evident in every movement, but everyone present understood that they were attempting something that pushed the boundaries of what could be accomplished under emergency conditions. The improvised operation would test not just surgical competence, but also the ability of the entire medical team to function effectively under circumstances that exceeded their normal training and experience. Sarah watched the emergency surgery with the focused attention of someone who understood both the technical complexity of the procedures being performed and the human dynamics that determined outcomes during life-threatening medical interventions. Her observation was characterized by the calm assessment of someone who had witnessed similar situations under different circumstances, where life and death decisions were made under extreme pressure and success depended on exceptional skill, courage, and teamwork. Her understanding of surgical procedures suggested knowledge that extended far beyond typical civilian familiarity with medical environments. The surgery progressed with Williams identifying and repairing internal injuries, while the nursing staff maintained life support functions and monitored for complications that could develop during the operation. The coordination required among team members working in cramped conditions with improvised equipment exceeded normal hospital protocols and demanded exceptional communication and adaptability from everyone involved. The success of the operation would depend as much on teamwork and problem-solving ability as on surgical skill and medical knowledge. Anderson continued monitoring Emma's vital signs while assisting with surgical procedures, his emergency medical training providing valuable perspective on patient care during trauma operations. His experience with pre-hospital medicine had taught him to recognize signs of improvement or deterioration that might not be apparent to personnel focused on specific surgical tasks. The dual responsibilities required constant attention to multiple aspects of patient care while anticipating the needs of surgical team members working under extreme pressure. The emergency department continued receiving casualties from weather-related accidents throughout the region, creating additional pressure on resources and personnel who were already stretched beyond normal capacity. Torres was coordinating patient care activities while simultaneously managing resource allocation decisions that would determine the hospital's ability to provide effective treatment for all incoming patients. The complexity of crisis management exceeded normal administrative responsibilities and required innovative approaches to healthcare delivery under emergency conditions. Johnson assisted with the surgical procedures while monitoring Emma's neurological responses for any indication of improvement or continued deterioration from her earlier cardiac arrest. Her nursing training had prepared her for the technical aspects of surgical assistance, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional intensity of participating in life-saving surgery on a patient whose survival remained uncertain despite the exceptional efforts being made on her behalf. The professional composure required during medical emergencies became increasingly difficult to maintain when outcomes remained doubtful. The surgery reached a critical point where Williams identified the source of Emma's internal bleeding and began repair procedures that would determine whether the operation would be successful or whether additional complications would develop that could prove fatal despite all intervention efforts. The technical complexity of the repairs required surgical skill that pushed the boundaries of what could be accomplished under emergency conditions, where standard equipment and procedures were unavailable and innovative approaches were necessary for patient survival. Sarah's attention to the surgical procedures was noted by several members of the medical staff, who were impressed by her apparent understanding of complex medical interventions and her ability to remain calm during the intense emergency situation. Her behavior was consistent with someone who possessed extensive knowledge of trauma medicine and emergency surgery, though her official status as a medical equipment sales representative seemed inadequate to explain her level of expertise and professional composure under pressure. The moment was approaching when circumstances would make continued concealment of her background impossible, as the developing medical crisis would soon require intervention that exceeded the capabilities of currently available personnel and would reveal exactly who Sarah Mitchell really was and why her presence in the emergency department represented far more than routine sales activities. The catastrophe unfolded in the span of 3 heartbeats. Dr. Williams encountered massive internal bleeding that exceeded anything her surgical experience had prepared her for, with Emma's abdominal cavity filling faster than suction equipment could clear the blood. The improvised trauma bay surgery had revealed injuries so extensive that conventional repair techniques were proving inadequate, and Williams found herself facing the stark reality that her patient was dying despite every intervention attempt. Her hands worked with desperate precision, but the technical challenges were compounding faster than solutions could be implemented. Emma's blood pressure plummeted as her cardiovascular system approached complete collapse, despite aggressive fluid resuscitation and blood product transfusions that were consuming the hospital's emergency reserves. The cardiac monitor displayed the erratic rhythms that indicated her heart was struggling to maintain circulation through damaged blood vessels that could not be repaired quickly enough to prevent exsanguination. Johnson continued manual ventilation, while monitoring for signs that Emma's brain was being deprived of oxygen, knowing that each minute of inadequate circulation increased the probability of permanent neurological damage, even if the bleeding could eventually be controlled. Anderson was calling out vital sign readings with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to function during medical crises by focusing on specific tasks rather than contemplating the broader implications of deteriorating patient conditions. His emergency medical training had taught him to provide accurate information to surgical teams without editorial commentary about patient prognosis, but everyone in the trauma bay understood that the numbers he was reporting indicated imminent cardiovascular collapse. The blood loss was approaching levels that were incompatible with survival, and conventional medical interventions were proving insufficient to reverse the downward spiral. Dr. Brooks stood frozen again, his theoretical knowledge completely inadequate for the reality of watching a 16-year-old patient die despite the desperate efforts of experienced medical personnel. His paralysis during the cardiac arrest had been embarrassing, but his inability to contribute meaningfully during the emergency surgery was becoming genuinely dangerous as Williams struggled with repairs that required assistance from someone with advanced surgical training. The gap between his confidence and his actual capabilities was creating exactly the kind of situation where patients died because available resources could not be utilized effectively. Williams was reaching the limits of what could be accomplished with current personnel and equipment, facing surgical challenges that required expertise and resources that simply were not available under the circumstances. Her hands were steady and her technique was flawless, but the technical demands of repairing massive trauma exceeded what could be achieved in an improvised operating room with limited equipment and inadequate assistance. She was confronting the agonizing reality that sometimes exceptional skill and determination were not enough to overcome the combination of severe injuries and suboptimal treatment conditions. Torres watched from the edge of the sterile field, her administrative experience allowing her to recognize when medical situations were evolving beyond available resources and capabilities. Her responsibility as emergency department director included making difficult decisions about resource allocation and treatment priorities, But Emma's case had become the kind of medical emergency where standard protocols were inadequate and innovative approaches were necessary for any hope of patient survival. The institutional support systems that normally provided backup during complex cases remained unavailable due to weather-related complications. The trauma bay had become a scene of controlled desperation, with medical personnel implementing every available intervention while confronting the growing probability that their efforts would prove insufficient. The emotional weight of potentially losing a young patient was affecting everyone involved in her care, but professional training demanded that they continue working, despite the discouraging vital signs and the technical challenges that seemed to compound faster than solutions could be found. The line between appropriate medical intervention and futile care was becoming increasingly unclear. Sarah Mitchell had been watching the surgical crisis develop with the calm attention of someone whose background had taught her to assess emergency situations and identify critical decision points where outcomes could be influenced by timely intervention. Her positioning near the trauma bay had allowed her to observe the technical aspects of the surgery and evaluate the capabilities of the medical personnel who were struggling with repairs that exceeded their training and experience. Her assessment was reaching conclusions that would soon make continued concealment of her expertise impossible. The moment arrived when Williams encountered a surgical complication that she had never seen before, involving damage to blood vessels in a configuration that standard repair techniques could not address effectively. Her surgical training had been comprehensive and her experience was extensive, but the specific combination of injuries was creating technical challenges that required innovative approaches she was not prepared to implement. The realization that she was confronting something beyond her capabilities was devastating for a surgeon who had successfully managed countless complex cases throughout her career. Williams stepped back from the operating table with the expression of someone who had reached the end of available options, her hands still steady but her face reflecting the emotional impact of acknowledging that conventional medical approaches were not going to save Emma's life. She had never experienced the professional agony of recognizing that her surgical skills were inadequate for a patient who might survive with different expertise or better resources. The weight of potential failure was crushing for someone whose career had been built on successful outcomes during life-threatening medical emergencies. Anderson continued monitoring Emma's vital signs while watching for any indication that the bleeding was being controlled or that her cardiovascular status was stabilizing. But the readings he was reporting confirmed that her condition was continuing to deteriorate despite all intervention efforts. His emergency medical training had taught him to maintain professional composure during patient care activities, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional impact of providing life support for a teenager whose survival was becoming increasingly unlikely. The human cost of medical limitations was becoming painfully apparent. Johnson maintained mechanical ventilation, while struggling with the emotional reality that her nursing care might not be enough to keep Emma alive until effective surgical repair could be accomplished. Her training had prepared her for the technical aspects of emergency nursing, but the psychological burden of participating in potentially futile medical care was overwhelming for someone who had chosen healthcare as a profession because of her desire to help people recover from illness and injury. The possibility of losing a patient who was younger than her own sister was emotionally devastating. Brooks remained paralyzed by the gap between his theoretical understanding of trauma surgery and the reality of implementing life-saving interventions under emergency conditions where textbook solutions were proving inadequate. His inability to provide meaningful assistance during the most critical moments of Emma's care was professionally humiliating and personally devastating. But his lack of practical experience meant that his contributions were more likely to interfere with treatment efforts than to improve patient outcomes. The harsh reality of medical education limitations was becoming apparent in exactly the worst possible circumstances. Torres was facing the administrative nightmare of explaining to hospital administrators and patient families how available medical resources had proven inadequate to save a young patient whose injuries might have been survivable under different circumstances. Her responsibility for emergency department operations included accountability for patient outcomes, but the current situation involved factors beyond institutional control that were preventing optimal medical care. The combination of weather-related complications and resource limitations was creating exactly the kind of perfect storm that emergency administrators planned for but hoped never to experience. Sarah's assessment of the surgical crisis had reached definitive conclusions about what needed to be done to save Emma's life, and her evaluation of available personnel had determined that current medical staff lacked the specialized expertise necessary for successful intervention. Her background included advanced training in exactly the kind of trauma surgery that Emma required, and her experience with emergency medicine under extreme conditions had taught her to recognize when situations demanded immediate action regardless of personal consequences. The moment had arrived when continued concealment of her capabilities would mean accepting responsibility for a preventable death. She moved toward the trauma bay with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a critical decision and was prepared to accept the consequences of revealing information that was supposed to remain classified indefinitely. Her approach was noticed by several members of the medical staff who had observed her apparent expertise during previous emergencies, but no one was prepared for what happened when she reached the edge of the sterile field and began removing her business jacket with movements that suggested familiarity with surgical preparation procedures. Sarah rolled up the sleeves of her white blouse, revealing forearms marked with scars that told the story of advanced medical training under combat conditions. The marks were precise and deliberate, indicating surgical procedures that had been performed on her own arms to demonstrate techniques for emergency field medicine. The scars were the kind that military medical personnel acquired during training programs that prepared them for providing life-saving care under enemy fire, where conventional medical facilities were unavailable and innovative surgical approaches were necessary for saving lives. Williams looked up from Emma's surgical site and noticed Sarah's scars with the instant recognition that marked someone who understood exactly what kind of training produced such marks. The precise patterns and deliberate placement indicated advanced combat medical training that went far beyond standard civilian or even military medical education. The realization that a medical equipment sales representative possessed evidence of specialized surgical training was shocking, but Williams was too experienced to question good fortune when it appeared during medical emergencies. Sarah stepped into the sterile field with movements that demonstrated immediate familiarity with surgical protocols and emergency medical procedures. Her transition from observer to participant was seamless, indicating training and experience that allowed her to function effectively in high-pressure medical environments without adjustment periods or uncertainty about procedures. Her presence brought a level of calm authority that was immediately apparent to everyone involved in Emma's care, suggesting expertise that exceeded what any of them possessed. Her assessment of Emma's injuries was rapid and comprehensive, identifying technical challenges that had been overwhelming the surgical team and developing solutions that reflected training in innovative medical approaches designed for extreme circumstances. Sarah's evaluation revealed damage patterns that she had encountered during combat medical operations, where unconventional injuries required creative surgical techniques that were not taught in standard medical education programs. Her experience with trauma surgery under adverse conditions had prepared her for exactly the kind of challenges that Emma's case presented. Sarah began implementing surgical procedures that none of the hospital staff had seen before, using techniques that reflected advanced combat medical training and experience with trauma repair under circumstances where conventional approaches were inadequate. Her methods were innovative but clearly based on solid medical principles, demonstrating expertise that had been developed through practical application rather than theoretical study. The surgical interventions she was performing required skills that could only be acquired through specialized training and extensive experience with complex trauma cases. Williams assisted with growing amazement as Sarah demonstrated surgical techniques that addressed the specific complications that had been preventing successful repair of Emma's injuries. The approaches were unconventional but clearly effective, reflecting medical knowledge that had been developed for situations where standard protocols were inadequate and innovative solutions were necessary for patient survival. Williams had never encountered surgical methods that were so precisely adapted to extreme circumstances, but the results were immediately apparent in Emma's improving vital signs. Anderson watched Emma's cardiovascular status stabilize for the first time since the emergency surgery had begun, with blood pressure readings indicating that the massive bleeding was finally being controlled through surgical techniques that had seemed impossible minutes earlier. His monitoring equipment was recording the kind of dramatic improvement that marked successful intervention during life-threatening medical emergencies, but he had never witnessed such rapid stabilization following such severe trauma. The transformation was remarkable and suggested surgical expertise that exceeded anything he had previously observed. Johnson noticed immediate improvements in Emma's respiratory function as the successful surgical repair reduced internal pressure that had been compromising her lung capacity. Her neurological responses were also showing signs of recovery, indicating that brain function was being preserved through interventions that were preventing further deterioration. The changes were dramatic enough to suggest that the surgical procedures being performed were addressing fundamental problems that had been causing Emma's condition to deteriorate despite previous intervention efforts. Sarah worked with the focused intensity of someone who had performed similar procedures under combat conditions where patient survival depended on technical precision and innovative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Her surgical technique was flawless, but more importantly, her approach to complex trauma repair reflected training and experience that had been specifically designed for saving lives when conventional medical resources were unavailable. The procedures she was implementing were saving Emma's life through methods that none of the hospital staff had known were possible. Brooks watched in amazement as Sarah demonstrated the kind of surgical expertise that he had hoped to develop through years of additional training and experience. Her competence was humbling, but more significantly, her willingness to risk exposure of her background in order to save a patient's life illustrated the kind of professional commitment that transcended personal considerations. The contrast between his paralysis during medical emergencies and her immediate decisive action was a harsh lesson in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Torres recognized that Sarah's intervention was saving Emma's life through surgical techniques that exceeded the capabilities of any medical personnel currently employed by Riverside General Hospital. Her administrative experience included oversight of trauma surgery programs, and she understood that the procedures being performed required training and expertise that were not available through standard medical education programs. The implications of Sarah's surgical capabilities raised questions about her background that would need to be addressed once the immediate medical crisis was resolved. The surgical repair was completed within 45 minutes, with Emma's vital signs stabilizing at levels that indicated successful intervention and probable survival without significant complications. Sarah's surgical technique had addressed all of the technical challenges that had been preventing effective treatment, using innovative approaches that had controlled the massive bleeding and repaired damage that had seemed beyond the capabilities of available medical resources. The transformation from near-certain death to probable full recovery was remarkable and suggested medical expertise that belonged in specialized trauma centers rather than routine hospital operations. Williams completed her assessment of the surgical repair with professional amazement at the technical quality of the procedures that had been performed. The surgical techniques were beyond anything she had encountered during her medical training or professional experience, but the results were undeniably successful and had saved Emma's life through interventions that seemed almost miraculous. Given the severity of her injuries, the level of surgical expertise that Sarah had demonstrated exceeded what Williams had believed was possible under emergency conditions with limited resources. Anderson confirmed that Emma's cardiovascular status was stable and that her vital signs indicated successful treatment of the trauma that had brought her to the emergency department. His monitoring equipment was recording normal ranges for all critical functions, suggesting that the surgical intervention had not only prevented death, but had also restored her physiological systems to levels that predicted complete recovery. Without long-term complications, the dramatic improvement was the kind that emergency medical personnel hoped for, but rarely witnessed during severe trauma cases. Johnson observed Emma's neurological responses returning to normal levels, indicating that brain function had been preserved throughout the medical crisis, and that cognitive abilities would probably not be affected by her injuries or the extended period of cardiovascular instability. Her nursing assessment confirmed that the surgical procedures had been successful in every measurable way, transforming what had appeared to be a fatal case into a routine recovery that would probably allow Emma to return to normal activities. Within weeks rather than months, Sarah stepped back from the operating table and began removing the surgical gloves that had allowed her to maintain sterile technique during the emergency operation. Her transition from active surgical intervention back to observer status was as smooth as her initial involvement had been, but everyone in the trauma bay understood that they had witnessed medical expertise that raised fundamental questions about who she really was and how she had acquired surgical skills that exceeded those of trained emergency physicians. Torres approached Sarah with the expression of someone who needed immediate explanations for events that had exceeded all reasonable expectations about medical emergencies and personnel capabilities. Her administrative responsibilities included oversight of all patient care activities, and Sarah's intervention had involved procedures that required documentation and explanation that went far beyond routine medical records. The institutional implications of unidentified personnel performing advanced surgical procedures needed to be addressed immediately. Dr. Harrison arrived at the trauma bay as Emma's surgery was being completed, having been summoned by reports that emergency surgical procedures were being performed by someone whose medical credentials were unknown to hospital administration. His responsibility as chief of staff included ensuring that all patient care met institutional standards and legal requirements. But Sarah's successful intervention created the complicated situation of questioning the background of someone whose expertise had clearly saved a patient's life under circumstances where conventional medical approaches had failed. Sarah faced the assembled medical staff with the calm composure of someone who had always known that her background would eventually be revealed if circumstances required her to use her specialized training. Her decision to abandon her cover in order to save Emma's life had been made without hesitation, but she understood that the consequences would include questions about her identity and background that she had worked carefully to avoid. The moment had arrived when concealment was no longer possible and explanations would be necessary. Harrison spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone who needed immediate answers to questions that affected both patient care standards and institutional liability. His inquiry was professional but firm, reflecting the responsibility that hospital administrators carried for ensuring that all medical procedures met legal and ethical requirements regardless of their outcomes. The successful surgery had saved Emma's life, but it had also created administrative complications that needed to be resolved. Sarah's response was direct and honest, acknowledging that her background included medical training that exceeded what her current employment indicated. Her explanation was careful but truthful, revealing that her expertise had been acquired through military service in medical specialties that remained classified but had prepared her for exactly the kind of trauma surgery that Emma had required. The revelation that a medical equipment sales representative possessed advanced combat medical training was shocking, but explained her surgical capabilities and her decision to intervene when conventional treatment approaches had failed. The discussion that followed involved questions about Sarah's medical credentials, her military service record, and the circumstances that had led to her current employment as a civilian contractor rather than active medical practice. Her answers were honest but limited by security classifications that prevented detailed discussion of her background. But the evidence of her surgical expertise was undeniable and had clearly saved Emma's life when hospital resources had proven inadequate. The administrative complications were significant, but the successful patient outcome made questioning her intervention ethically difficult. Williams expressed professional gratitude for Sarah's assistance during the emergency surgery, acknowledging that Emma would have died without the specialized expertise that Sarah had provided. Her recognition of Sarah's surgical skills was based on first-hand observation of techniques that had exceeded her own capabilities and had addressed technical challenges that she had been unable to resolve. The collaboration had been successful, beyond any reasonable expectation, and Williams was eager to understand how such expertise could be made available for future emergency situations. Torres confirmed that Emma's condition was stable and that her recovery was proceeding normally, with all vital signs indicating successful treatment of the injuries that had brought her to the emergency department. The medical crisis had been resolved through intervention that had exceeded all institutional capabilities, but the patient outcome was entirely successful and justified whatever administrative complications might arise from Sarah's unauthorized involvement in emergency medical procedures. The priority remained patient care, and by that measure, Sarah's intervention had been unquestionably appropriate. Harrison made the decision to suspend administrative questions pending Emma's complete recovery and a thorough review of the circumstances that had led to Sarah's involvement in emergency medical care. His priority was ensuring that patient care standards were maintained while acknowledging that Sarah's intervention had achieved results that were beyond hospital capabilities and had clearly saved a life that would otherwise have been lost. The institutional response would need to balance regulatory requirements with recognition of exceptional professional competence. Sarah accepted that her background would be investigated and that her current employment situation would probably be affected by the revelation of her medical expertise. But her primary concern remained Emma's continued recovery and the welfare of other patients who might benefit from her capabilities if institutional arrangements could be developed. Her decision to reveal her background had been motivated by patient care considerations, and she was prepared to accept whatever personal consequences resulted from that choice. Emma's recovery proceeded without complications, with her vital signs remaining stable and her neurological function returning to completely normal levels within hours of the successful surgery. The trauma that had brought her to the emergency department had been completely repaired through surgical techniques that had seemed impossible under the circumstances. But her prognosis was excellent, and she was expected to return to normal activities without any long-term effects from her injuries. The transformation from near-certain death to complete recovery was remarkable and represented exactly the kind of outcome that justified whatever administrative complications might arise. The emergency department gradually returned to normal operations as the weather-related crisis subsided and additional casualties stopped arriving from accident scenes throughout the Portland metropolitan area. The institutional strain that tested hospital resources and personnel capabilities was relieved, but the events of the evening had revealed both the limitations of standard medical approaches and the key potential benefits of innovative expertise when conventional resources proved inadequate. The lessons learned would influence emergency preparedness planning and personnel development for years. Sarah's background investigation confirmed her military service record and her advanced medical training, though many details remained classified and could not be disclosed through normal administrative channels. Her expertise was genuine and had been acquired through specialized programs that prepared military medical personnel for providing life-saving care under extreme conditions where conventional resources were unavailable. The revelation explained her surgical capabilities and justified her decision to intervene during Emma's medical crisis. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell was offered a position as emergency department trauma consultant at Riverside General Hospital, with responsibilities that would utilize her specialized expertise while respecting the security classifications that limited discussion of her background. Her acceptance of the position meant that her medical capabilities would be available for future emergency situations, providing institutional access to surgical expertise that had proven invaluable during life-threatening cases that exceeded normal hospital capabilities. Emma Chun returned to school 6 weeks after her accident, with no lasting effects from injuries that had nearly cost her life. During that winter evening when weather conditions had created a crisis that revealed hidden heroism and exceptional medical expertise, her recovery was complete, and her gratitude to the medical personnel who had saved her life included particular appreciation for the woman, whose background remained largely mysterious, but whose intervention had made survival possible when conventional treatment approaches had failed. The quiet woman who had once seemed like just another medical equipment sales representative continued her work at Riverside General Hospital, but now her presence carried the respect that came from proven expertise and demonstrated commitment to patient care under the most challenging circumstances. Her background remained largely classified, but her capabilities were no longer hidden, and her contributions to emergency medicine were recognized by colleagues who understood that some heroes worked in silence until circumstances demanded that they step forward to save lives that would otherwise be lost. The records would never fully capture the story of how a Navy SEAL's daughter had broken every record that mattered by saving lives that others couldn't save, and broken hearts along the way, including her own, as she sacrificed her carefully constructed anonymity to ensure that a 16-year-old girl would live to see graduation, college, marriage, and all the dreams that had been preserved through surgical skill that came from serving in places that didn't exist on official maps. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside General Hospital parking lot as Sarah Mitchell walked toward the employee entrance, her new identification badge catching the light with each step. 6 months had passed since that winter night when freezing rain and human tragedy had converged to reveal capabilities she had spent years keeping hidden. The medical equipment sales case was gone, replaced by a surgical bag that marked her transition from concealment to acknowledged expertise. Her footsteps echoed with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to pretend to be less than she actually was. The emergency department bore little resemblance to the chaos that had defined it during the multi-vehicle accident crisis. Morning shift personnel moved through their routines with the practiced efficiency of a well-coordinated team, but there was an underlying awareness that their capabilities had been fundamentally enhanced by the addition of someone whose background brought expertise that exceeded normal institutional resources. The trauma bay where Emma Chun had nearly died had been redesigned and upgraded with equipment that reflected Sarah's recommendations for managing complex surgical emergencies under adverse conditions. Dr. Patricia Williams paused at the central nursing station to review the overnight patient census, her silver hair now touched with genuine warmth when she noticed Sarah's approach. The professional relationship that had developed between them was built on mutual respect earned during that critical surgery, where Williams had witnessed techniques that expanded her understanding of what was possible in emergency medicine. Their collaboration had evolved into a mentoring partnership that benefited both physicians and enhanced the hospital's trauma care capabilities in ways that exceeded all administrative expectations. Emma Chen's recovery had become something of a legend within the hospital community, not just because of the severity of her injuries or the dramatic nature of her treatment, but because her case represented the kind of medical success story that reminded healthcare workers why they had chosen their profession. Her follow-up appointments had documented complete healing without complications, and her gratitude toward the medical team had been expressed through volunteer work in the emergency department that brought hope to other families facing similar crises. Her presence served as tangible evidence that extraordinary medical intervention could produce miraculous outcomes when conventional approaches proved inadequate. The administrative investigation into Sarah's background had concluded, with official recognition of her credentials and formal acknowledgement of her expertise. Though many details of her military service remained classified beyond the reach of normal hospital documentation, Dr. Harrison had navigated the bureaucratic complexities with the determination of someone who understood that exceptional medical capabilities deserved institutional support, regardless of their unconventional origins. The paperwork had been extensive, but the patient outcomes that resulted from Sarah's involvement justified whatever administrative complications had been required to formalize her position. Nurse Katie Johnson had flourished under Sarah's informal mentoring, developing clinical skills and emergency response capabilities that exceeded what her relative inexperience would normally have predicted. The young nurse had demonstrated exceptional potential during the crisis situations, and Sarah's guidance had accelerated her professional development in ways that benefited both her career advancement and patient care quality. Johnson's progress illustrated how expertise could be transmitted through practical collaboration and demonstrated the value of having someone with Sarah's background available for teaching and consultation. The hospital's trauma program had gained regional recognition for innovative surgical techniques and exceptional patient outcomes, with medical professionals from other facilities requesting consultations and training opportunities that reflected Sarah's influence on emergency medicine practices. Her presence had elevated institutional capabilities and attracted the kind of professional attention that enhanced Riverside General's reputation for excellence in emergency care. The transformation had occurred gradually but persistently, with each successful case building institutional confidence and professional recognition. Dr. Ryan Brooks had requested transfer to internal medicine, acknowledging that emergency surgery required capabilities and judgment that he had not yet developed despite his theoretical knowledge and academic credentials. His decision reflected genuine self-awareness about his limitations and represented the kind of professional maturity that served patients better than misplaced confidence in abilities that had not been proven under pressure. The humbling experience of recognizing his inadequacies had ultimately contributed to his development as a physician, though his path would lead away from trauma care toward specialties that better matched his current skill level. Sarah's integration into the hospital community had been remarkably smooth, with colleagues responding to her expertise with the respect and appreciation that marked professional environments where competence was valued over credentials. Her willingness to share knowledge and provide mentoring created an atmosphere of continuous learning that enhanced everyone's capabilities and improved patient care throughout the emergency department. The collaborative relationship she had developed reflected the kind of teamwork that made challenging medical cases manageable through shared expertise and mutual support. The trauma-based surgery that had saved Emma's life had become a case study that was discussed in medical education programs and professional conferences, though Sarah's role was described in general terms that protected her background while highlighting the importance of innovative surgical techniques in emergency medicine. The medical procedures she had demonstrated were now being taught to trauma surgeons throughout the region, expanding the availability of advanced life-saving capabilities beyond the single institution where they had first been revealed. Her influence on emergency medicine practices was extending far beyond Riverside General Hospital. And T. Marcus Rivera had developed a professional relationship with Sarah that reflected mutual respect between emergency medical professionals who understood the challenges of providing life-saving care under extreme conditions. His pre-hospital experience complemented her surgical expertise, and their collaboration had improved the coordination between emergency medical services and hospital-based trauma care. Rivera's recognition of her capabilities had led to enhanced communication protocols that ensured critical information was transmitted effectively during patient transport operations. Paramedic Tom Anderson had become an advocate for advanced trauma training programs that would expand the emergency medical services capabilities for managing complex cases during transport to definitive care facilities. His experience during the crisis had demonstrated the value of having personnel with advanced medical training available during mass casualty situations, and his recommendations for system improvements reflected lessons learned from witnessing Sarah's intervention. Anderson's advocacy was contributing to regional emergency medical services development that would benefit future patients requiring complex care. Director Rebecca Torres had been promoted to Regional Emergency Services Coordinator with responsibilities that included developing protocols for managing large-scale medical emergencies and coordinating resources among multiple healthcare facilities. Her success in managing the winter crisis had demonstrated administrative capabilities that exceeded normal departmental leadership, and her understanding of how exceptional medical expertise could be integrated into institutional operations made her valuable for system-wide improvements. Torres's career advancement reflected recognition of her ability to manage complex situations and utilize available resources effectively. The weather that had created the initial crisis had become a distant memory, but the lessons learned during that challenging evening continued to influence emergency preparedness planning throughout the Portland metropolitan area. Hospital administrators and emergency medical services coordinators had developed enhanced protocols for managing weather-related disasters with specific attention to resource allocation and personnel deployment during extended emergencies. The institutional changes reflected recognition that exceptional circumstances required innovative approaches and flexible utilization of available expertise. Sarah's living situation had evolved to reflect her permanent integration into the Portland community, with a downtown apartment that provided easy access to the hospital while offering the privacy that someone with her background required. Her civilian life had developed naturally around her professional responsibilities, with friendships and social connections that respected her need for discretion about her past while appreciating her contributions to their present community. The balance between professional visibility and personal privacy had been achieved through careful attention to maintaining appropriate boundaries. The classified aspects of Sarah's background remained protected through security protocols that allowed her to utilize her medical expertise while preventing disclosure of operational details that could compromise national security interests. Her civilian employment had been structured to accommodate these requirements while providing maximum benefit to patient care and institutional capabilities. The arrangement represented successful integration of military-trained personnel into civilian healthcare systems without compromising security classifications or reducing medical effectiveness. Emma Chun had returned to school with renewed appreciation for life and enhanced understanding of the medical professionals who had saved her when conventional treatment approaches had failed. Her experience had influenced her career planning toward healthcare fields, with particular interest in emergency medicine and trauma surgery. Emma's academic performance had improved following her recovery, perhaps reflecting the perspective that came from surviving circumstances that had provided stark reminders about the fragility of life and the importance of pursuing meaningful goals. The surgical techniques that Sarah had demonstrated during Emma's emergency operation had been documented and incorporated into trauma surgery training programs, with careful attention to maintaining patient confidentiality while sharing medical knowledge that could save future lives. The procedures were being taught at medical schools and residency programs throughout the region, expanding the availability of advanced surgical capabilities that had previously been limited to military medical facilities. Sarah's willingness to share her expertise was multiplying her impact on patient care, far beyond her direct involvement in individual cases. Hospital staff members who had witnessed Sarah's intervention during the crisis had developed enhanced appreciation for the depth of knowledge and experience that could be hidden behind unremarkable appearances and routine job classifications. The lessons about not making assumptions based on superficial observations had influenced interactions throughout the institution, creating a more respectful and inclusive professional environment. The cultural changes were subtle but persistent, reflecting increased awareness that exceptional capabilities could exist in unexpected places and circumstances. The emergency department's enhanced trauma capabilities had attracted regional referrals for complex cases that exceeded the resources available at smaller healthcare facilities, creating opportunities for Sarah to utilize her expertise on a regular basis while contributing to medical education and professional development activities. Her presence had transformed Riverside General into a recognized center of excellence for emergency trauma care, with patient outcomes that exceeded regional averages and professional recognition that attracted top-quality personnel seeking opportunities to work with exceptional medical talent. Sarah's daily routine had evolved to include formal teaching, responsibilities that allowed her to share knowledge with medical students, residents, and experienced physicians seeking to enhance their emergency surgery capabilities. Her instructional approach emphasized practical application of theoretical knowledge, with particular attention to decision-making under pressure and innovative problem-solving when conventional approaches proved inadequate. The educational programs she had developed were attracting participants from throughout the medical community and contributing to enhanced trauma care capabilities across multiple institutions. The transformation from concealed identity to acknowledged expertise had required psychological adjustment for someone whose survival had once depended on remaining invisible and unremarkable. Sarah's adaptation to professional recognition and institutional responsibilities reflected the resilience and flexibility that had characterized her military service, though the transition from operational secrecy to civilian transparency required different skills and emotional adjustments. Her success in managing this transition demonstrated the same competence and determination that had marked her combat medical service. The winter evening that had changed everything remained vivid in the memories of everyone who had participated in the crisis, but the passage of time had provided perspective that allowed them to understand the broader significance of what they had witnessed. The revelation that exceptional capabilities could be hidden behind ordinary appearances had influenced their professional and personal interactions in ways that extended far beyond medical practice. The experience had provided lasting lessons about respect, humility, and the importance of recognizing that everyone carried stories and capabilities that might not be immediately apparent. Sarah Mitchell had finally found a place where her extraordinary background could contribute to saving lives without compromising the security requirements that protected both her identity and national interests. Her integration into civilian medical practice represented successful transition from military service to civilian contributions that utilized her unique expertise while providing the professional satisfaction that came from using exceptional capabilities to benefit others. The balance between her past and her present had been achieved through careful attention to both security requirements and patient care responsibilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.